Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. This month marks the 100th anniversary of James Joyce's publication of Ulysses, considered one of the most significant novels in the English language and also considered one of the hardest to read. Today we're going to be in conversation about this monumental work and about its significance for the modern reader. My guest for this conversation is Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges has a new piece at sheerpost.com called Heading the Lessons of James Joyce's Ulysses, a Century Later. Chris Hedges is the author of a number of books. His latest is called Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. He's also host of the TV show On Contact that can be seen on RT America. In fact, he did a program just a few days ago that you can find online about James Joyce's Ulysses. He joins me over Zoom. Chris Hedges, great to see you again, sir. Thank you for taking this time to join me.
Oh, thanks, Mitch.
You write this in the piece that I was referencing on SheerPost, again called Heeding the Lessons of James Joyce's Ulysses, a Century Later. And you write this, quote, on Wednesday, February 2nd, which is already passed, which was Joyce's birthday, and the day Sylvia Beach handed him the first printed copy of his book, with its blue cover and white lettering in 1922, I will walk the few blocks from my house in Princeton to the cemetery where Beach is buried to say thank you. I began there because it was an interesting part of this story about Sylvia Beach, who was the founder of the Shakespeare Company bookstore in Paris. And that was the bookstore that first, and the only publication at the time, that would print Ulysses.
Yeah, she was a remarkable figure, and that bookstore functioned as a kind of nerve center for these amazing expatriate writers, Richard Wright, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, Thornton Wilder, Ezra Pound, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and of course James Joyce. Joyce had published excerpts of the book, but he just no publisher in the English-speaking world would touch it. It was subsequently banned, of course, in the United States and the UK after it came out for obscenity, didn't appear. Random House finally published it in the 1930s. And so, although Sylvia Beach was not a publisher on a subscription basis, she managed to print 1,000 copies. It's quite a kind of famous edition because since the typesetters were French, it didn't speak English, there's all sorts of errors in it. But yes, she published that 732-page novel that has become a classic, one that I've read 3 different times and admire immensely.
And she's from Princeton.
Yes, her father was the Presbyterian minister in the church in Princeton. Yeah.
Interesting. You read Ulysses 3 times. It's again one of the most important novels in English language, also considered one of the hardest.
Well, not compared to Finnegan's Wake. And you have to remember, coming out of a theological education, I had to plow my way through Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which makes Ulysses look like a romp. I always advise people to read it because he makes all sorts of literary, mythical illusions. There's a wonderful book of annotations by Don Gifford that I advise people. There's another book, when I first read Ulysses, it was called Ulysses on the Liffey, but that's kind of a nice way to catch the references. He was a kind of linguistic genius in the sense that the book, I don't write about this in the column, but it replicates all sorts of different styles in a kind of parody in many ways, including at the time, the Irish literary revival, which Joyce was quite critical of. It's just a remarkable book. There are parts of it that are best read out loud. I've never managed to finish Finnegan's Wake, but friends of mine who have say you really have to read it out loud to get through it. The Irish National Theatre several decades ago did a kind of audio production of Ulysses with every character in the book being played by a different actor that is just stunning. For instance, there's a scene in the bordello scene which is really just written as radio drama. The last chapter, the a monologue by Molly Bloom, one of the most famous monologues in English literature, has virtually no punctuation. So a few years ago, my wife, who's an actor at the Culture Project in New York on Bloomsday, June 16th, performed the monologue. So I think a lot of Joyce's writing, certainly in Ulysses, is many ways written to be heard out loud. But it's a wonderfully, beautifully rich book, and it's one of those books that it really takes the second reading to begin to plummet its depths, I think.
The title, Ulysses, is monumental in of itself. And Ulysses, of course, is a Latinized version of Odysseus. We think of Homer's Odyssey here. And that's interesting because in some way, these stories couldn't be any more different. Homer's Odyssey, and no one believes it was one man who wrote the Odyssey, but came from an oral tradition, but that Homer's Odyssey was about Odysseus' return from the Trojan War that took 10 years and many adventures, whereas James Joyce's Ulysses is about a single day and really follows a single sort of normal individual by the name of Leopold Bloom.
That's right. So what he did, and this is when T.S. Eliot writes this famous review. T.S. Eliot deeply admired the book, writes this famous review, said that it was a kind of revolutionary moment in literature because the mythic triumph, that in many ways it was a novel rooted in the mythic. And that's right. So what you have is the recreation or reincarnation of these classical figures in the Odyssey within the working class in Ireland. So Ulysses, who's the king of Ithaca, and as you mentioned, is spending 10 years in the Odyssey trying to get back to Ithaca, and when he arrives, slaughters the suitors who are besieging his household and attempting to gain the hand of his wife, Penelope, is transformed into Leopold Bloom as a 38-year-old ad canvasser for a newspaper in Dublin. Then you have Telemachus, who's Ulysses' son, who leaves at the beginning of the Odyssey in an attempt to find his father, because he's already spent 10 years fighting the war in Troy, so it's 20 years that he's away, becomes a kind of version of James Joyce's very precocious younger self, and Molly, who is the wife of Leopold Bloom, is the Penelope figure. But of course, unlike Penelope, she during the day has a tryst with her lover, Hugh Blazes Boylan. And what Joyce really did is capture the heroism of the unsung, the unnamed, those whom history have forgotten, and I think really asks us to consider a different kind of greatness, in that the ordinary become extraordinary, or that the ordinary are extraordinary. I mean, V.S. Pritchett, another writer I admire very much, does this in his short stories.
Finding the epic, monumental myths in daily life.
Yes, exactly, and that there is a kind of heroism to Bloom. Bloom is his father was an observant Hungarian Jew. His mother was Catholic. He himself is not observant. He's culturally Jewish, but there's that famous scene where he relishes pork kidneys. But throughout the day, he suffers from anti-Semitism, sometimes subtle and sometimes in the hands of the citizen, who is this kind of Trumpian, cyclopean figure. It's called the Cyclops, this nationalist. And Joyce detested nationalists, including Irish nationalists. He understood that nationalism is toxic. And nationalism is always about the elevation of self, either individually or as a group, and the denigration of others. And there's just a deep humanity to Bloom, and it's set against the callousness and the bigotry and the violence in the rest of the world. Joyce spent a lot of time writing this book during the suicidal slaughter of World War I. And Joyce, unlike a lot of artists and writers, especially at the inception of the war, never signed on for the nationalist armed causes that seduced so many. In fact, he was quite critical of it. And like Joyce, Bloom is quite consciously a pacifist. So there is that kind of that, although the book takes place in 1904, it has as its backdrop, you feel it throughout the book, not only the war, but then of course the Easter Rebellion in 1916 in Ireland, where this abortive attempt to rise up and overthrow British rule, which ends in disaster for the armed groups that carry it out.
Did he pick a side in that conflict with the British?
Well, he hated the British, but he also understood the poison of the nationalist fervor that gripped quote-unquote Irish patriots. Joyce was famous supposedly for never picking sides. That's probably a little unfair. I think it's probably better to say that he just hated violence of any kind. And I actually, in the column on ScheerPost that you mentioned, I quoted this. There's this little passage between Leopold Bloom and the Citizen. So the Citizen is speaking of the detested British. They believe in the rod, the scourger almighty, creator of hell upon earth, and in Jackie Tar, the son of a gun who was conceived of unholy boast, born of the fighting navy, suffered under Rump and Dozen, was sacrificed, flayed, and curried, yelled like bloody hell. The third day he arose again from the bed, steered into heaven, sitteth on his beamine till further orders whence he shall come to drudge for a living and be paid. And Bloom answers about this, well, isn't discipline the same everywhere? I mean, wouldn't it be the same here if you put force against force? So there's a deep loathing on the part of Bloom and Joyce, of course, towards violence of any kind. But also, I would say the other subtext is this distaste for those who are incapable of expressing remorse or compassion, and he's juxtaposing figures like Bloom with others like the Citizen or the estranged father of Stephen Dedalus, who mistreated his late wife and mistreats his children.
Is this the lesson that you write about in your piece at ScheerPost.com, heeding the lessons of James Joyce's Ulysses a century later?
Well, those are some of the, I think, most important, and I think the novel has a lot to say to us who are gripped now by fierce divisions within our population and the rise of this proto-fascist nationalism, and then, of course, as a culture, this kind of lust for violence. Joyce, at the same time, is very critical of officialdom, the way officialdom speaks, the press, which he calls dead noise, which fragments reality into these quickly and easily digestible sound bites, which highlights the trivial and the salacious and the extraordinary at the expense of our reality, and essentially distorts and lies. Joyce creates these figures. He was very critical of the Catholic Church, Father John Comey in the novel The British Viceroy, and shows how power is almost always disconnected from the lives and concerns of the citizen, and he parodies the bankruptcy of their pretensions. So yeah, it's an amazing literary and social document that I think explores issues that that's its power, that are kind of timeless. And that's the power. We go back to the Greek myths, that all of these confrontations are part of what it means in this sojourn that we take between birth and death. And that is the power of the book, because a lot of the issues that are raised in the book are not resolved, or not, in that sense, it has a kind of narrative structure in that it starts in the morning and ends I think at 4 in the morning or something, but very late at night. But the issues that are raised are not resolved, as they are often not resolved within our own lives.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about James Joyce's monumental work, Ulysses, which this month turned 100 years of age. We are in conversation with author and journalist Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is the author of a number of books. His latest is called Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. And we're talking about his piece that has been published at sheerpost.com called Heeding the Lessons of James Joyce's Ulysses, a Century Later. Chris Hedges, you mentioned that this book is being written around the time of World War I. Is that significant?
Yeah, I think it is. Joyce had been in Trieste, which it gets caught up in the war, of course, and he goes to Zurich, neutral Switzerland, in order to write. He doesn't, the book continues after the war, but this suicidal slaughter is happening all around him, and actually in the column I quote this satirical wartime poem that he wrote. It's called Dooley's Prudence. So he's speaking in the voice of this Martin Dooley, who was this literary personage that was invented by Finley Peter Dunne, and it ridicules everyone around him who's been seduced and gripped by this war fever. And in the poem he writes, "Who is the tranquil gentleman who won't salute the state, or serve Nebuchadnezzar or proletariat, but thinks that every son of a man has quite enough to do to paddle down the stream of life, his personal canoe? It's Mr. Dooley, the wisest wit our country ever knew. Poor Europe ambles like sheep to shambles, sighs Mr. Dooley, ooly, ooh." That's another thing about Joyce that I think is often missed. He can be absolutely hilarious. He's very funny. I mean, there are passages in the book that are just very bawdy, which is, he won't. There's, of course, the famous masturbation scene and defecation scene, and Molly Bloom talking about passing gas and menstruation and everything else. All of those kind of human bodily functions are important to Joyce because they deflate these figures who, through power, through pretension, somehow want to elevate themselves above the rest of us.
It was a book for everyone. You had many classical references that many people may not necessarily get, but then it was also full of, I guess, quote unquote, bathroom humor.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think Joyce just wanted to humanize. I mean, one of the interesting things that was actually when I did my program on Joyce with Professor Sam Slode, who teaches Ulysses, teaches Joyce at Trinity College Dublin, he made a really interesting point that there are no crowds. There are crowds within Dublin, but nobody ever gets caught up in the crowd. Everybody is individualized, especially in the chapter Wandering Rocks. So everybody's humanity and everybody's dignity and everybody's uniqueness, if you will, is kind of respected within the book. I mean, I think that, the book came out in 1922, and what we would consider so bawdy or obscene or salacious, it's very timid or mild at this point. I mean, even the masturbation scene on the beach is kind of veiled. There's nothing kind of raw about it. I mean, it's kind of funny, actually, in a way that he writes it, because it takes place while fireworks are going off and this kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, but all of this was, of course, completely groundbreaking, especially in terms of English literature. You might have seen a little more of it in the French novels, Flaubert and others, but yeah, it was a seismic moment in American literature. Well, it wasn't American, in world literature.
English literature, yeah.
English literature. Well, he was Irish, so I don't know if
well, English language.
English language, there you go.
What do you think the significance of Molly Bloom's affair was? And this is an affair that Leopold Bloom seemed to accept.
I don't know if he accepted, but he was aware of it. And there, when there are references to Hugh Blazes Boylan, who's a singer and sings with Molly, who's a professional singer, it clearly pains him in the novel. It's difficult for him. Well, the book is permeated by death, and there's a famous chapter, the Hades scene, where he goes to bury somebody and ruminates on death itself. But Leopold Bloom is haunted throughout the book by the death of his infant son about a decade earlier, Rudy, who died at 11 days old. And from the moment of his death, he and Molly have not had sexual relations. And so after, there's no indication in the book that she has had a sexual relationship with Hugh Blazes Boylan before, and after it's consummated, after it's over, she's kind of repulsed by it. But it's because that death has severed their sexual intimacy that she reaches out, and this is the power of Leopold Bloom. He understands, and we didn't like it. And I'm not going to ruin the end of the book, but because it's, it should rip your heart out to read it. But it's it deals with that estrangement, and I'm not going to ruin the last chapter. Read it.
Chris,
it's beautiful. It's just gorgeous.
Chris Hedges, you have covered a number of wars and civil wars on a number of continents, including the former Yugoslavia, Latin America, the Middle East. And we were talking about how this book was written around the time of World War I. And World War I has been something that's been heavy on my mind of late, as we see what's happening now in Ukraine, the situation with Russia, NATO, the United States, that whole dynamic. And the reason why I keep thinking about World War I, and I don't mean to lead the question here, and if I am, you'll let me know, but I keep thinking about this because nobody thinks there's actually going to be a hot war, at least between the United States and Russia over this. But nobody thought in the years leading up to World War I that there was going to be a major war either. Do you see a significance there? And does Ulysses tell us anything about that, or am I just leading us?
Well, once you start playing with armies and fleets, once you start posturing, once you start drawing lines, you can inevitably be drawn into a conflict, even if you don't really want it. And that was, I think, is pretty strong evidence that Kaiser wanted it, but I don't think anybody else wanted it. And I think a lot of people thought, of course, they were all related by the monarchs throughout Europe. And I think you're right, that this is always very dangerous because, and I learned that in war, once you open that Pandora's box of war, especially once violence begins, it controls you. You don't control it. And it becomes, you speak exclusively in that language. So someone speaks to you in an act of violence, you respond in an act of violence, and then it just devolves from there. So yes, I mean, this is what's always frightening about these kinds of confrontations, because even if both parties don't expect it or don't want it, it can still happen. And that, of course, is the lesson of World War I, where people kind of, and Barbara Tuchman has written a good book about this, The Guns of August, kind of stumbled into this absolutely suicidal venture where the working class, working men in Europe, in Germany and in Great Britain and France, were just wiped out, and by the millions.
We think we have full control over these, but it's very interesting that you say once you draw lines and start going over them, they lead to new lines, and we may not have as much control or as easily be able to stop the momentum once it begins.
Yeah, well, that's why you always want to have robust diplomatic entities within your country. And of course, this is another issue, but the whole State Department has become so anemic in the face of military power. And the whole reason the war in Afghanistan just never ended is because the military didn't want it to end, and the State Department was essentially rendered powerless in the face of military hegemony within the system. It has all the resources, it has all the power, it has all the money. And that's, of course, exceedingly dangerous. These military entities seek to perpetuate themselves, and the best way to do that is to foment conflict, expanding NATO. We should be clear that Ronald Reagan promised Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany, but Raytheon and Halliburton and Boeing and these people saw money to be made by expanding NATO up to the borders of Russia, these provocations with China. The whole perpetuation of the endless wars in the Middle East, which we know from the Afghan papers published by the Washington Post, everyone knew they weren't going to win. But, as usual, war is a very lucrative business, and some people make a lot of money on it. And they will push you into these conflicts or perpetuate them solely for profit. That's something, by the way, Joyce was acutely aware of.
How so?
Well, just his disdain for militarism of any kind. I mean, and colonialism of any kind. He understood that this was really, at its core, about profit, about making money, about seizing. Of course, he was Irish. He was colonized. He was living under British rule, and it was about the subjugation of indigenous indigenous communities and the theft and plundering of their resources. That's what colonialism. That's its raison d'etre.
We certainly already sent a ton of weapons to the region, to Ukraine specifically.
Yeah, well, I mean, I covered conflicts in countries like Africa that are just awash in weapons, and the whole arms trade itself is one of the major factors behind these perpetual conflicts, because they empower people with a penchant for violence and an access to weaponry, and it distorts the kind of balance within the country by, again, in the same way we have in the United States, empowering those forces that are designed to be violent at the expense of other aspects of civil society.
Chris Hedges has been our guest. Again, Chris Hedges is an author and a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He has joined us to talk about his article called Heeding the Lessons of James Joyce's Ulysses, a Century Later. His latest book is called Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in American Prison, and he also hosts the television show On Contact that could be seen on RT America. Chris Hedges, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mitch.